Welcome to the second lecture on Japan. And I'm just reviewing a little bit, showing the periods in Japan. Right now, we're going to talk about prehistoric Japan, so the Jomon period. So in the Jomon period, the things that we have are these terracotta ceramic, both figures we're going to look at a little bit later on, and vessels like this. And like a lot of early ceramic traditions, the Jomon period ones were made by women. And this seems to be a dynamic that we see around the world. And these ceramics are some of the oldest fired ceramics in the world. Certainly people that, prehistoric, like cavemen or whatever, had made things with clay. But as far as fired ceramics, these are some of the oldest in the world. And right away, early on, we can see this idea of the essence of materials and the dialogue between the material and the finished product. So this particular piece is made with rolled cords, and that's the same technique that we had seen when we looked at the first emperor of China's tomb for his terracotta warriors. But if you remember, when they made it, they covered up the fact that it was made with rolled cords. If you looked at it from the outside, you wouldn't know. You just saw a finished product that looked like a naturalistic copy of a real person. Whereas in Japan, the nature of the materials is shown in the finished work. So these cord markings that we're seeing, if you look at this piece, we can see the cords in the finished piece. And again, we're going to see this type of idea of a respect for the intrinsic nature of materials throughout the Japanese section. So the people that made this were pre-agricultural in the earliest times. And Japan in general was hunter-gatherers until 5000 BCE. So that's very unusual for hunter-gatherers to be making fired ceramics. It may be unique to Japan. So what's interesting about that is that if you're a hunter-gatherer, you have to move from place to place usually to be able to follow game and to get the seasonal type of fruits and nuts and such that you have to get. But in Japan, there may have been just very good conditions. People, even though they were hunter-gatherers, may have been able to settle down in one spot, which could have allowed them to create the kilns that they would need to create to be able to fire these ceramics. The particular piece we're looking at is from the Middle Jomon period, and this is the period that's most popular with collectors because you can kind of see it. It has lots of details and lots of interesting things going on. Just like with the intrinsic nature of materials, we can also see in this earliest period this value in asymmetry, things that look natural, and we can see that in this particular piece with organic lines and the asymmetry of the vessel. So the female figure comes from a time when Japanese people were farming. And this is something we'll often see in pre-agricultural societies where we have kind of like a feminine figure. But this particular one may have qualities that show that this is a farming type of society. So if you want, you could use the extra credit board or the comments in this YouTube video to kind of look at this particular figure and try to figure out what is the artist emphasizing in this figure. So pause the video and put your comments on what you think is being emphasized by the artist. And then I'll talk about what I think. So pause the video now. So what I'm thinking about this piece and what scholars have been thinking and also previous students is that there's an emphasis on feminine qualities of the figure. So she has this very small waist and these wide hips. But there's also, prominent nipples, but there's also a certain amount of emphasis on things that maybe people wouldn't normally consider to be feminine, like the very thick neck I had someone in a previous class that said, well, if you're a farmer, you're carrying things all around all the time, so you have some thick traps. So maybe that's it. It's supposed to show a sturdy farming woman or something along those lines. You also notice the eyes are not very realistic. Sometimes people look at the face and say that it's like pig-like, which is entirely possible. We see things like that. And then very, very sturdy legs, and the addition of patterning on it. So there isn't an attempt, even though the artist could certainly do so, to create an exact naturalistic depiction of a woman. But some of the modifications to the naturalistic feminine form may have had meaning to the artist. So the source that I got this from says that perhaps it's a rise in ritual practices. Perhaps she represents some kind of like goddess figure or a saint-like figure, something along those lines. We don't know. So the Yayoi period is traditionally the first imperial period. So the first period where the Japan had emperors. So in the 1000 BCE or so, we start to see rice cultivation in Japan. And remember when I talked about rice cultivation before in China, that shows that we already have a sophisticated community society. Rice can't be the first crop that you domesticate because you have to already have a settled and organized community to be able to accomplish rice cultivation. So that means irrigation, and people have been living in communities for quite a long time. The Yayoi period, which is known as, since ancient times in Japan, we start to see cloth weaving, glass making, bronze and iron casting, and these types of practices came from Korea, including the materialists. So the Yamato emperors, who traditionally go back to 660 BC with the legendary first emperor, Jimmu Tenno, but historically, we have pretty solid evidence that it goes back to at least 180 CE, where, again, traditionally, the history is kind of hard to pin down. Japan was united under Queen Himiko. So all of the descendants of Queen Himiko continued as the imperial family today, and the current emperor is descended from Queen Himiko. So this is the longest unbroken dynasty in world history, as far as ruling dynasties go. So what we're looking at in the picture is a dotaku. And these particular pieces are kind of a mystery. They're in the shape of musical instruments, but most people think they weren't played because they're rather thick and they wouldn't sound very good if you played them as bells. If you were going to use them as bells, you would have different types of shapes. There's also a lot of details on the bell shapes that show it probably has more of a symbolic purpose. It's possible that these were worshipped. And one of the reasons why people think so is because when these were found, they were buried basically in their own tombs on hillsides, separate from the tombs of people. So it could have been that they saw these pieces as having some kind of like spiritual power or even spirits inside of them that had to be placated and have their own separate tombs. So one of the common, so in the shape of musical instruments, probably not played, the Jotaku were buried singly, in pairs, and in large groups, occasionally with bronze mirrors and weapons, and isolated locations, often on hilltops. So again, this is an interesting practice with these. So they may have had some kind of spiritual meaning. As far as the motifs and the art on them, deer were a part of a common motif on the Dotaku. And just to read some of my notes, there may be some reasonings for this. So Yayoi people ate mostly wild boar, and illustrations of deer appear the most in Dotaku. So it's not because they were eating it. The Harima Fudoki, the local record of the Harima province, compiled in the Nara period, and we'll talk about why that it was things like this were written in the Nara period, tells us a magical ritual of sowing seeds in deer blood was used to speed up the germination of rice plants, and that people believed the deer's life force helped in the growth of rice. I just thought that deer came to play an important role in agrarian rituals, in a way because the annual cycle of deer antlers, their new growth in the spring, their development over the summer and the autumn, and their shedding in the winter was connected to regeneration, growth, and decay of plants. So if you come from up in Michigan, you may already know what this looks like, but I encourage you to look up deer antler shedding and check out the pictures, and you can see how they look bloody when they're shedding. But it happens in the spring, so there became their association with planting and regeneration that you get in a temperate climate like Japan. And these types of ideas continue in some of the things that we see. Like if we look at the deer god from Princess Mononoke, and the screenshot I'm taking is actually more kind of bizarre and fantastical when you see it in the movie, because you only see it for a millisecond and you can barely process that this deer is not a normal deer. It's got these chicken feet and it has a human type face and these very strange antlers. And if you watch the movie, you'll learn about how this particular deer god is a symbol of the life of the forest. And I don't want to give away the end of the movie, but there's processes of regeneration that are associated with this particular deer god. So normally I would do this in class, but what I want you to do is if you can do it on your own, or if you care to, you can do it in the extra credit board, is kind of compare and contrast these figures and think about how they use materials. The contemporary figures, one the left from Japan that we already looked at, and one on the right from China. So look at it and think about how each of the societies uses the materials. How does each portray the figure? And you may want to look at like naturalism versus abstraction. And how does each reflect what you know about each society? You know quite a bit about China at this point, starting to learn about Japan. Go back to those values, those characteristics of Japanese art that we looked at, and see if you can apply them to this. So I encourage you to do this on the extra credit board. So we'll move to the next lecture,